Welcome to This Explainer. If you're a first-year law student staring down a massive tort law syllabus right now, take a deep breath. We've got this. Today, we're going to unpack the foundational concepts of negligence, giving you the exact structural blueprint you need to absolutely ace your exams. We're looking specifically at how to establish a duty of care and how to prove a breach of that duty.
So let's dive right in. We're starting with arguably the most famous question in legal history. It was posed by Lord Atkin in the House of Lords back in 1932. Who, then, in law, is my neighbor? It sounds a bit like a philosophical riddle, right? But the answer to this very question literally birthed the modern law of negligence.
And that question led to this, the absolute granddaddy of negligence rules. Lord Atkin laid it down: you must take reasonable care to avoid acts or omissions which you can reasonably foresee would be likely to injure your neighbor. It was a massive breakthrough at the time. But, as we're going to see, it actually proved to be a little too broad for modern courts to handle. Here is our roadmap for building out the duty of care framework today. First, the snail in the bottle. Second, the modern Caparo test. Third, foreseeability and proximity. Fourth, fair, just, and reasonable. And finally, the reasonable person standard. Section 1. The snail in the bottle. All right, let's build our foundation with the messy and honestly pretty gross genesis of negligence. The case is Donoghue v. Stevenson. The year is 1932. Mrs. Donoghue goes to a cafe, and her friend buys her a ginger beer. The bottle is made of dark glass. She drinks some, pours the rest out, and, yep, out plops a dead, decomposing snail. She suffers physical and psychological injuries. Now, here was her legal hurdle. Mrs. Donoghue couldn't sue the cafe using contract law because she didn't actually buy the drink. Her friend did. No contract, no claim. So she sued the manufacturer in negligence, claiming they owed her a duty of care. And the House of Lords? They actually agreed, creating a brand new legal relationship that didn't rely on a contract.
Which brings us back to that crucial point. Your legal neighbor isn't just the person living next door. According to the court, it's anyone who is so closely and directly affected by your actions that you ought reasonably to have them in mind when you're acting or, failing to act. If you manufacture ginger beer, your legal neighbor is the ultimate consumer. Period.
Section 2. The modern Caparo test.
So the complication with Lord Atkin's neighbor principle was simply that it was way too wide. For years, judges applied it, but as new and increasingly bizarre situations came before the courts, judges started panicking. They were terrified of opening the floodgates to unlimited lawsuits by totally unrelated strangers. They realized that just because harm is foreseeable, it doesn't mean society actually benefits from imposing legal liability. They demanded a stricter, much more structured rule to keep those floodgates firmly shut.
Enter Caparo v. Dickman in 1990. The House of Lords scrapped their old piecemeal approach and laid down this exact three-part test. First years, you absolutely must memorize this for your exam. To establish a duty of care in a novel situation today, you have to prove three things. 1. Is damage or harm reasonably foreseeable? 2. Is there sufficient proximity between the claimant and defendant? And 3. Is it fair, just, and reasonable to impose a duty? Let's break these down.
Section 3. Foreseeability and proximity. Let's examine how courts actually test the boundaries of liability in the real world. Pillar 1 asks, could a reasonable person foresee that their actions would cause damage to another? Establishing foreseeability depends entirely on the specific facts of the case. A great example is Kent v. Griffiths from the year 2000. An ambulance is called for a patient having an asthma attack. For no obvious reason, it fails to arrive within a reasonable time, and the patient suffers a respiratory arrest. The court easily decided it was reasonably foreseeable that failing to arrive promptly would cause further illness to this specific patient.
Then we have Pillar 2, proximity, which essentially means legal closeness. Even if harm is foreseeable, the relationship has to be close enough. Contrast these two cases for your exam to see exactly where that boundary is drawn. In Borehill v. Young, a pregnant woman getting off a tram merely heard a crash caused by a negligent motorcyclist. She later saw the blood, suffered shock, and tragically had a stillborn baby. The court said no duty was owed. She was a bystander, not sufficiently proximate to the motorcyclist. But compare that to McLaughlin v. O'Brien. Here, a mother rushes to a hospital to see her severely injured family 2 hours after a horrific crash. She suffers severe psychiatric injury. The court ruled a duty was owed here, extending proximity to the immediate aftermath of the event for close relatives. This perfectly shows how courts carefully limit the class of people who can actually claim.
Section 4. Fair, just, and reasonable.
Okay, so even if harm is clearly foreseeable and the parties are proximate, the claimant still has to pass the final hurdle. The third pillar is entirely about public policy, what is best for society as a whole. Look at the tragic case of Hill v. Chief Constable of West Yorkshire. The mother of the Yorkshire Ripper's very last victim sued the police, arguing they had enough evidence to catch him earlier and owed her daughter a duty of care. But the House of Lords ruled that imposing a duty on the police toward the general public just wasn't fair, just, or reasonable. Why? Because it could lead to defensive policing. The police would spend all their time worrying about being sued instead of actively fighting crime, which would divert vital resources.
Section 5. The reasonable person standard.
Let's say you've successfully used the Caparo test to prove a duty of care exists. Awesome. But establishing a duty is only half the battle. To complete the liability equation, we've got to prove a breach of that duty. The standard of care in law is entirely objective. You aren't judged on your own personal best effort. Your actions are judged against how a competent, ordinary person would perform that exact same task. Historically, lawyers called this the man on the Clapham omnibus, basically the everyday person on the street. Now, how helpful a 19th century London bus commuter is as a legal benchmark today is definitely up for debate. Regardless, if the reasonable person would have checked their blind spot before merging and you didn't, you have breached your duty of care.
But what if the defendant has special characteristics? What if they're a doctor, a mechanic, or an accountant? The reasonable person standard adapts. The 1957 Bolam case established that professionals are judged by the standard of their profession as a whole. So a surgeon isn't judged against the man on the Clapham omnibus. They are judged against the standard of a reasonable, competent surgeon.
You might want to pause this explainer and jot this down, because this right here is your ultimate study guide. It maps every major principle we've discussed today straight to its corresponding case and judgment. You've got your foundational neighbor principle in Donoghue. You've got your modern three-part test in Caparo, and your specific applications for foreseeability, proximity, and policy in Kent, Borehill, McLaughlin, and Hill. If you can confidently cite these on your paper, you are in incredible shape.
Let's wrap up with a quick hypothetical to test your exam prep. Does a Coast Guard owe a duty of care to a yachtsman whose boat is sinking? I'm not going to give you the answer. I want you to apply the three-part Caparo test to this scenario. Think about foreseeability, think about proximity, and heavily weigh whether it's fair, just, and reasonable for society to hold emergency rescue services legally liable. Because figuring out these novel situations is exactly what you'll need to do on exam day. So what do you think? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and happy studying.